A decade and a half ago, I met the chief of a European IT services firm. His lament was that even though his shareholders were asking him what his India strategy was, he neither had his own development centers here in India, nor was he able to buy out a mid-sized Indian IT services firm for what he called a reasonable price. The pain was writ large on his face. Today, that question is being posed to more than just global IT services firms. Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, Bharat Kumar. Today, let's start off by looking at a few recent headlines that have called out India's economic potential. Only last week, Morgan Stanley said that India was at the start of a long wave boom. It moved India in its estimates from equal weight to overweight, and it moved Australia down to underweight and China down to equal weight. The brokerage said India's future looks to a significant extent like China's past. It said, our economics team thinks trend GDP growth in China is likely to be around 3.9% at the end of this decade versus 6.5% for India. The India upgrade comes after Morgan Stanley previously elevated India from underweight to equal weight on March 31st. Separately, global debt rating agency Fitch put US down a notch from the top-rated AAA to AA+. This is still a rating that allows investors to safely invest in a country, but it does project a gloomy future for the US. It projects a future period of expected fiscal deterioration and is also a reflection of the past last-minute negotiations on debt ceilings that highlight problems in the government's ability to pay its bills. Remember, this is the US. Let's come back to India. Last week, Mahindra & Mahindra chairman Anand Mahindra, while addressing shareholders at the AGM, said that India was now within pole-vaulting distance of replacing China as the factory to the world. In a recent episode of Business Matters, we saw why India had only a narrow window of opportunity to make the best of the China plus one strategy. There's fear and anxiety whether we'd miss the bus this time or not. But encouragingly, this question is also being posed to global multinationals by thinkers, advisors to businesses, and consultants. Does your company have an India strategy? That's actually the title for an article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review late June this year. It was written by a group of professors led by Professor Vijay Govindarajan. In their own words, if any multinational does not have an India strategy now, they are missing out on a major opportunity for growth and profitability. How do they arrive at this conclusion? In the answer to this lies a small lesson on a metric or one of the metrics that investors use to value companies. Stay with me because this gets interesting. The authors cite that price-to-book ratios of Indian subsidiaries of multinationals far exceed those ratios of the parent companies. This, the authors say, suggests that there is immense growth potential for these Indian subsidiaries. They also correlate this with India's growing middle class. They cite the example of European consumer products giant Unilever plc. The parent company had a P to B ratio, price to book ratio, of 6 at the end of financial year 2022, while the Indian subsidiaries was twice that at 12. And the authors also point out that this is not because the Indian subsidiary is young or small, but it's a 90-year-old company with a market capitalization of $76 billion. In the article, they also present a similar case for Switzerland's Nestle, America's 3M, and Germany's BASF and Siemens, and their respective Indian subsidiaries. The price-to-book ratio represents how a company's assets are priced by the markets. The authors assert that it is higher for companies with better growth prospects, measured by revenue growth, more profitable operations, measured by profits to sales ratio, more efficient utilization of assets, and lower cost of capital. A lower cost of capital could not be the reason for higher price-to-book ratios for Indian subsidiaries. They say, a company's cost of capital is limited by its country's sovereign rating. India's sovereign credit rating, given to us, for example, by Fitch and Standard & Poor, is a lowly BBB-. At the time that all this data was analyzed for the article, the authors assert that the US, Germany, and Switzerland have all had top-notch and the highest grade for ratings. When an investor sees that a rating agency has given the highest grade to a sovereign country, then they're able to put in their funds without risk of losing it all, in which case funds will be made available to borrowers at a lower interest rate because the risks are low in those countries. Which means India is actually at a disadvantage here compared to those three countries taken in this example. But still, the subsidiaries of these MNCs showed better metrics in the form of better price to book ratios. So the authors argue that lower cost of capital could not have contributed to a better P/B ratio, but opportunity for growth and higher profitability could have been the reasons. On profitability, here's the author's take. Indian subsidiaries of global MNCs are able to show better margins because the cost of production and distribution is far lower in India than in any of the Western economies in question. As to growth potential, for long as Indians, we've talked about our potential. And in this case, the burgeoning middle class in India is quite a reason to offer hope. A recent survey by think tank People Research on India's Consumer Economy, or PRICE, showed that the Indian middle class grew from 14% of its population in FY05 to about 31% in FY21. It is expected to grow to 47% of the population by FY31 and comprise 61% by FY47. A Brookings Institution study forecast that the next billion entrants into the middle class globally would see 380 million of those from India. And the authors of the article at the Harvard Business Review point out that this is higher than China's own contribution of 350 million. All of these pieces of data put together paint such a rosy picture for India. But as we walk with our head in our clouds, it's also important to keep our feet on the ground. So the question to ask is, are there any roadblocks in our economic path forward? We spoke to Anil Padmanabhan, a journalist who tweets at Capital Calculus. He has observed that India in the past has flattered to deceive. So let's go over and listen to what he thinks the future holds for us.
Professor Srivastav's point is about a trend. So he and his colleagues have picked a trend and they have enclosed it within a larger framework of a lot of things that are happening around in India and argued their case. In my instance, why I use that phrase is I've been around a long time and I have, like I said, India has flattered to deceive so many times in the past. And as an Indian, I'm an eternal optimist. I've always hoped that this was the tipping point, but been disappointed, which is why I threw in that element of caution. And as a journalist, we are trained to be skeptics. So I will tend to be skeptical. But having said that, I think there is a happy convergence of circumstances which is happening right now, which we have never witnessed in the past. I was very young in school when Hamara Bajaj was launched and it dared the Indian middle class to dream. Then, of course, Maruti came along in 84, a small 800cc car, taught us how to drive. Then, if you recall, for the consumer economy, as far as we were concerned, we never got anything ready-made or imported and things like that. So you had to wait in queue to get a pair of jeans or basic things like that. Consumer economy was in a complete doldrums. Tipping point was Aadhaar. The introduction of Aadhaar was at that time a very low-key launch, but most people never understood the power of a unique identity. Today, it has created a digital economy foundation, which is now the world is interested in it. And India has kind of pioneered the idea of using digital economy for doing public good, and at fantastic scale. So if you pull all of this together, what we have seen today is a tremendous transformation of India, which is no longer identified as the largest number of poor, the biggest cohort openly defecating. All these are history. So India has traded up. If you pull all of this together, like I said, it's a happy convergence of circumstance. So this time it looks like Anup Srivastav may be spot on, but like I said, I will always tend to be skeptical. I agree with you. Too much emphasis on one metric is generally out of whack. You will get a very distorted view, a skewed view, as it were. So, but to the credit of the professors, they have picked that metric like a segue into a larger claim. So they have used that to, and it is well established from the data they have used. If you look at the graphic, it's very clear. The PB ratio for India and the India arm and the global arm is, chalk and cheese. So there's no two ways about it. But to their credit, they have tagged it with a lot of other factors that are in play, including the digital economy that I mentioned earlier. So if you pull all these other trends together, then you see their ratio, it makes sense. But I will caveat it here in the sense that these tend to get exaggerated, this ratio, because there are very few stocks, in India to invest in. And particularly if you're an outsider looking in, you want to go with safe and secure stock, and which is obviously a few of them. So which means, excess demand driving limited supply, and it will result in exaggerated price, which tends to amplify their claim. But having said that, overall, they seem to have tempered this metric with tagging it with other trends, as I mentioned earlier. I think one biggest challenge, and India is living in denial mostly in public policy mindset, that ease of doing business is improved. It's a work in progress. I would say, as an optimist, that it's a cup half full, definitely not half empty. But what you said about foreign multinationals is they are slightly better off compared to the Indian companies. And you are talking about shutting a company, but the challenge of opening a company, launching a company is equally tough. The amount of paperwork and the kind of queries that come your way. If you want to register for GST, you need a house where they come and verify, or a residence or an office where they verify. Come on, I mean, if you got an Aadhaar, all this should have been bypassed, So eKYC happens for banks, geo data, everything is happening, but not for this. I mean, I just can't believe this. They have linked our PAN to our Aadhaar. They can't link GST to Aadhaar. Seriously, I mean, it is linked, but why can't that be a verification? So here, you can go on and on and on. I mean, it's a tale of woe. But point is that MNCs are slightly better off, and domestic companies are the worst off. In fact, they need to roll out ease of doing business, especially for domestic companies, to bring them on par with what they offer to foreign companies. Having said that, I would say on a relative scale, see, we are now actually started dreaming. 20 years ago, we would have said, oh, chalta hai, aisi hota hai, Today, we are no longer like that. We want to question, we say we are not happy with these half measures or no measures. We're questioning them. Going forward, there's phenomenal amount of work that has to be done. Let's take GST. I think it's the single biggest reform measure. You ask critics too, they will ask them, even the Gabbar Singh tax guys will concede is the biggest tax reform that has ever happened. But what are you doing today? You have got off to a great start. 6 years down the line, knew that the rates were too high, there were too many slabs, but you did it for the right reasons, because you didn't want revenue loss. You were scared. It was a new idea. Totally understandable. But 6 years down the line, you just make noises. You're not revisiting the idea. You're not willing to reduce rates. You still want to go high rates. You're still willing to keep two biggest commodities, alcohol and petroleum products, outside the purview of GST. So you cannot bring rates down unless you add them in. Then on top of that, you're messing up what is already there. Let me give you just two examples. They recently reduced the tax GST on food items sold at cinema halls from 28% to some 18%, 12%. But they say if you buy them in a package, with online cinema tickets, then it attracts 28%. Seriously? I mean, what kind of gobbledygook is this? So you have one rate. Either you have it 12% or you have 28%. Don't introduce two variants. What does the vendor do? Second, I just saw one news item which said that GST on cocoa. I mean, if you made one food item which uses cocoa, then it attracts 28%. But if it doesn't use cocoa, it's 5%. Seriously? Then if you book a ticket, bus ticket, interstate bus ticket for the regular people, like when people who are traveling between cities in non-AC buses, there is zero GST if you stand in queue. But if I use an app and book, which today most of India is on a smartphone and use an app, you pay 5% GST. Hello? I mean, how many variations are you introducing? You're basically introducing a gazillion tax variations out here. You're going back to the sales tax regime. So why? So this is what I meant. I think going forward, India has to rein in the bureaucracy, which is very unwillingly doing a mindset reset, and they work the levers of politicians who obviously weigh in on the final decision. So that is India's biggest challenge, red tape.
So in sum, there is a convergence of stars likely not seen before for India, and that will spur India on its path ahead for economic progress. But as Mr. Anil Padmanabhan cautions us, red tape will be our biggest hurdle to growth. And as usual, here's your factoid in our Did You Know section. India's GDP per capita is currently only $2,500 compared with $12,700 for China. This we took from the Morgan Stanley report that we referred to in this conversation. And why does this show great potential for India? Because we are a young population and China's is an aging population. It gives us a better chance to grow our economy with more productive people who will earn incomes. But for now, this is only a possibility. If we don't provide the skills to our youth to become employable, then it will become difficult to capitalize on this opportunity. And before we go away, here's your quiz question for the week. How long do you think did it take for the middle class population globally to reach a count of 1 billion following the Industrial Revolution? You're probably wondering what the answer to last week's quiz question was, which was what is the difference between an autopilot system in airplanes and artificial intelligence in aviation? Here's a slightly longish answer. Each aircraft has two autopilot systems, one active, one on standby. An autopilot system can carry out only predefined tasks selected by the pilot, like maintain a climb or descent profile, or maintain a direction, and so on. So essentially, the autopilot cannot think or act on its own. But there is a facility by which an auto land is possible. In fact, it's mandatory when visibility is less than 100 meters. But even that is under pilot supervision. Even for the auto land function to be successful, both autopilot systems need to be engaged. In addition, a radio altimeter use is also essential. In contrast, artificial intelligence in aviation is a tool by which the entire aircraft, landing, takeoff, cruise control, everything is controlled by the system. You do not technically need human intervention. And that is a system that plane makers are working on, as we saw in that episode. That's all we have for you now, folks. If you're watching this on YouTube, do not forget to like, share, subscribe, and click on the bell icon. Till we meet again, have a lovely week ahead.